On February 25th of this year, Josep Borrell, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, wrote on the official website of the EU Diplomatic Service the following: "If current global geopolitical tensions continue to evolve in the direction of West against the rest, Europe's future risks being bleak." He admits that Western dominance is over. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza, along with the anti-colonial uprisings in Africa's Sahel region, have significantly increased this risk of Europe becoming geopolitically irrelevant. One of the four main tasks on the EU's geopolitical agenda is to improve relations with the Global South, because they accuse them of double standards. Borrell is known for sporadically making frank comments, admitting uncomfortable truths that most European diplomats won't say. In 2022, the EU foreign policy chief confessed, "Our prosperity was based on China and Russia, energy and market, with cheap energy from Russia and access to the big Chinese market as the cornerstone of the European economy." However, Borrell's insistence that Europe must not divide the world into West versus the rest was contradicted by his insistence in the same February 2024 article that the EU must expand its cooperation with key partners, and in particular with the United States. The EU has been reminded in recent months how important NATO remains to its collective defense. This has generated a call to strengthen the US-led military bloc. In 2023, the influential think tank, the European Council on Foreign Relations, published a white paper titled "The Art of Vassalage." It warned that Europe is becoming a vassal of the United States, noting how the war in Ukraine had revealed Europeans' deep dependence on the United States. The EU foreign policy chief acknowledged that it would be a mistake to pit the West against the rest, but at the same time called for deepening the transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe, which only exacerbates that geopolitical divide. So in this video, we'll analyze how the exploited countries are now leading the economy, further analyzing the causes that have generated this shift. Let's get started. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell confessed that the West's neoliberal economic model was based on cheap energy from Russia, access to the big Chinese market, and low-paid Chinese workers. Europe has now lost this and is therefore in crisis. The economic prosperity of the West after the end of the First Cold War in 1991 was based on a neoliberal capitalist economic model that was only made possible by the extraction of wealth from China and Russia. China provided the United States and the EU with a huge market, low-paid labor, and cheap consumer goods. And after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, massive privatizations in Russia and moves to integrate it with the West helped Europe get huge amounts of cheap energy. But the significant rise in living standards for workers in China, as well as the proxy war in Ukraine and the corresponding EU commitment to boycott Russian gas and oil, have sharply increased the cost of living and doing business in Europe, making its products uncompetitive in global markets. This has plunged the transatlantic capitalist system into a deep crisis, motivating the neoliberal West to wage a new Cold War against Beijing and Moscow, in the hopes of reasserting control over China's market and labor and Russia's natural resources. That prosperity is now fading. By imposing devastating sanctions on Moscow over the proxy war in Ukraine and committing to boycotting Russian energy, Europe has lost its largest supplier of gas and oil. The EU is now looking for new sources of energy and importing much more expensive liquefied natural gas, or LNG, from the United States, which has caused electricity bills to skyrocket for European citizens and businesses. Now that China and Russia have become the EU's geopolitical adversaries, Europe will need a major restructuring of its economy. The EU will have to face a tough adjustment, which will create political problems. Europeans are facing the consequences of a process that has lasted many years, where they've decoupled their own sources of security and economic prosperity, causing a dependency that is now starting to take its toll. Hey, if you're liking this video, I invite you to like and subscribe to the channel. This would be truly rewarding for us. But let's continue. Europe's security policy was based on the United States and NATO, delegating security to the United States. While cooperation with the Biden administration has been excellent and the transatlantic relationship has never been as good as it is today, who knows what will happen 2 years from now, or even in November? What would happen if, instead of Joe Biden, it had been Donald Trump or someone like him in the White House? What would have been the US response to the war in Ukraine? What would have been the EU response in a different situation? These are some questions being asked by some leading EU politicians. The United States provided the security. China and Russia provided the basis for prosperity. This is a world that no longer exists. Everything has changed. Therefore, the EU must take on new responsibilities. The EU's security problems are not only external. Internally, Europe faces a threat from the radical right. There's a radical change, and the radical right is increasing democratically in the democracies. Rather than trying to blame this on a foreign bogeyman, this far-right turn is not an imposition by any one power. The radical right is increasing its influence in European politics. As a result, the internal cohesion of the EU is threatened. Europe is no longer dependent on Russian energy. It's becoming dependent on liquefied natural gas exports from the United States. Now, this poses its own new security problem. Regarding this, Emmanuel Macron mentioned at the Prague European Council, "We cannot replace one dependency with another." The EU is importing a large amount of liquefied natural gas from the United States, at a high price, by the way, and replacing Russian gas with US and Norwegian gas, or Azerbaijani gas, although the latter is in a small amount. But what would happen tomorrow if the US, with a new president, decided not to be so friendly to the Europeans? Why not? One could imagine the situation where critical dependence on LNG from the US could also be in crisis. Or that tomorrow the EU will have no cobalt, nor the rare materials coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, South America, Afghanistan. They're as critical to the EU as oil and gas. The world is in chaos, and some of the main causes are the NATO proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, the deep competition between the US and China, the food and energy crisis, and a looming economic recession. It's not only the proxy war in Ukraine that has destabilized Europe, but also the deep competition between the United States and China. The US government acknowledged that it bears responsibility for being on the brink of war. These conflicts, compounded by rising inflation and the food and energy crises, have created a perfect storm. This will inevitably lead to an economic recession, which is described as follows. This is the perfect storm. First, prices rise. Second, the central banks react by raising interest rates in the United States. Everybody has to follow, because otherwise, their currency will devalue. Everyone is racing to raise interest rates. This will lead to a global recession. The world following the Fed, the world implementing the same monetary policy, because there is no other way. Otherwise, capital will flow. This reminds us of what was happening in Europe before the euro, when everybody had to follow the monetary policy dictated by Germany. Because if you didn't do the same, capital would flow, and you had to do it, even if it wasn't the right policy for domestic reasons. What was happening in Europe before the euro is happening today on the world stage. But the problem doesn't end here. What's happening with the global south? Burkina Faso's new president, Ibrahim Traoré, has invoked his country's former revolutionary leader, Thomas Sankara, and quoted Che Guevara. The West African nation has also established close diplomatic ties with the revolutionary governments of Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran, as well as with NATO's arch-rival, Russia. In January 2022, a group of nationalist military officers in Burkina Faso overthrew the president, Roch Kabore, a wealthy banker who had fostered close ties with the country's former colonizer, France, where he was educated. The military declared a government led by what they called the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, or MPSR, headed by a new president, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. They promised to seek true independence from French hegemony, condemning the neo-colonial policies and the economic, political, and military control that Paris still exercises over French-speaking West Africa. Burkina Faso ended its decades-long military agreement with France, expelling the hundreds of French troops that had been in the country for years. The new president, Damiba, was initially popular, but support waned because he was unable to defeat the deadly Salafist jihadist insurgents who had destabilized the country. In September 2022, discontent sparked a subsequent coup in Burkina Faso, which brought another nationalist military leader named Ibrahim Traoré to power. As president, Traoré revived some of Thomas Sankara's revolutionary ideas. Sankara was a Burkinabe Marxist military officer and committed Pan-Africanist who rose to power in a coup d'etat in 1983. Under Sankara's leadership, Burkina Faso also challenged French neocolonialism and pursued an anti-imperialist foreign policy, forming alliances with revolutionary struggles throughout the global south. These leftist policies were reversed in 1987, when Sankara was overthrown and assassinated in another coup, led by his former ally, Blaise Compaoré, who subsequently swung strongly to the right and allied with the US and France, ruling through rigged elections until 2014. Today, Ibrahim Traoré relies heavily on Sankara's legacy. He's made it clear that he wants West Africa and the continent as a whole to be free of Western neocolonialism. On July 29th last year, the Russian government held a Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg. Traoré was the first African leader to arrive at the conference and held a private meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. There, he delivered a fiery anti-imperialist speech. "We are the forgotten peoples of the world, and we are here now to talk about the future of our countries, about how things will be tomorrow in the world we seek to build, and in which there will be no interference in our internal affairs," Traoré said. In his talks, the Burkinabe leader praised the Soviet Union for defeating Nazism in World War II. On the other hand, he's also strengthening ties with Latin American revolutionary movements. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has revealed the deep dependence of Europeans on the United States for their security, despite the EU's efforts to achieve strategic autonomy. Over the past decade, the EU has become relatively less powerful than the United States, economically, technologically, and militarily. The Europeans also continue to disagree on crucial strategic issues for themselves and look to Washington for leadership. In the Cold War, Europe was a central front in superpower competition. Now, the United States expects the EU and the United Kingdom to align with its China strategy and will use its leadership position to ensure this outcome. For Europe to become a vassal of the United States is unwise for both sides. The Europeans can become a stronger and more independent part of the Atlantic Alliance by developing an independent capability to support Ukraine and acquiring greater military capabilities. The Global South is exacerbating the weaknesses now being faced by the countries that have long been suppressing them. Thus, the West is beginning to come down hard on the rest of the world. Now, I ask you who are watching this video, do you believe that Western dominance is over? Let me know your answer in the comment box below. And if you like the video, I invite you to subscribe and leave your like for more videos like this one. With that, we'll see you next time.